whenever you're ready.
There's a logical structure to a thesis, as there is to a journal article. So I'm just going to think about the kind of writing and the purpose that you engage with as you go through different sections of a thesis. So you can plan it in advance, really. We start with the abstract. The first abstract you write is aspirational. This is the work that you're going to do, and that's the one that's attached to your proposal. But the final abstract that you write is when you've completed all the research and you know exactly what you found, and you know how you did it, and you know why it matters. So the abstract then starts by suggesting that there's a gap. There's a gap in the literature which your work's going to fill. So what is the gap? What's the focus, basically? Why are you doing the work the way that you're doing? So that's methods and methodology and something to do with theory. Explaining why you're doing it. Explaining how you're doing it. Methods, methodology, a bit of theory. What is it you've found or constructed in the research? And why does it matter? What's its contribution? If you think of those as the questions that the abstract answers, then you can start to aim towards constructing your abstract for your proposal and then your final abstract. It really does give away the game about what your research is all about. Doing a doctorate is not very much like a murder mystery. We don't wait till we get to the end of the doctorate to tell the reader what it is we've found and why it matters. We start by packaging it up, by marketing our work, by putting that in the abstract. And then if somebody's searching online and they find your abstract, they have a really good idea about what your research is about, and they want to go and find the doctorate. And the same thing goes for a journal article. It is your marketing tool. It's the first thing anybody finds before they actually go for the journal article, which they might have to pay for. So after the abstract, we have an introduction. And the introduction gives a sense of where the whole PhD, the doctorate, is going to be going. What's the direction? What it's going to be looking at? It's a kind of a mini doctorate in a sense. And this is also a point where if the context in which you're writing and the history of where your work is situated matter, you tell the context. You explain that you're doing your work in South Africa and that the cultural context and the historical context are different, so that somebody reading from Brazil will be interested because their work's similar, but they can see that the context has affected your work, and that's part of its contribution to knowledge. So a bit of the history maybe, and a bit of the context. You're also putting in the abstract, after you've given them a sense of the context, where an introduction to where the whole PhD is going, the main lines of argument, the main focus. So in this introduction, you've finished the PhD by the time you write your introduction. You know where the work went. And if your position, as in you've got special access or you've had a particular experience, if your positionality is important, you mention it there. So, for instance, you're writing about education and you're writing about secondary schools and you're a headmaster in Gauteng in South Africa. Now, you have a cultural context and you have a positionality from which to write. Later on, your positionality might enable you to get access to some of the people you want to work with or some of the processes you want to look at. Or it might also be something where you have to acknowledge that you are affecting what you're looking at and who you're talking to, from whom or what you're getting your information. So your positionality would come in there. So that's the introduction. It's kind of a map. What follows the introduction is the toughest part of doing a thesis, and we will have a whole section on this, but the literature review, theoretical perspectives chapter, which might not be called that. It might be cut up into a couple of headings in relation to the areas that you're working with. So, family law and public law or whatever you're focusing on, but that you here in this chapter you bring together your understanding of the theoretical perspectives that inform your work, that drive the questions you're asking, and help you come up with the responses, answers, suggestions that have come from your research. And at this point, you have to actually go off and read really heavy theory. you find the theories that help you ask your question. So they might be organizational theories, or they might be social theories, or they might be scientific theories. So each of the disciplines we're working with, and the corners of the disciplines we're working with, and the questions that you're asking, the research questions you're asking, which are also in the introduction, will be driving the theories that you're finding to help you ask those questions. So you have to get on top of that, understand it, represent them, and then start to say how you're going to use them. So that's engaging with the heavy theories, the heavy theorists that will give you a perspective of focus in order to ask your question. You're also then starting to read some of the contemporary critical voices. And some people suggest you don't go back with your reading beyond like 1984, but for me that's a bit random because with a literature review, we're looking at the way in which the conversations, the informed, theorized conversations, practical pieces of research have developed over time in your particular field in relation to the question that you're looking at. So if you're reading consistently, systematically, and you see people are starting to say all the same thing, suddenly there's a change in the literature and there's a new view about what assessment or about a geographical area or a cultural activity or whatever, they start writing differently. You mark the main arguments and the main trends in the literature, and you notice as they start to change their conversation, their focus. So you aren't actually having to log everything that everybody says. You're looking at these twists and turns and explaining how the literature conversation about your area of work, about your research questions and your interests has been developing over time until you come right up to date with what the recent conversations are all about. And at that point, you say, this work or my work or the work that was carried out, whichever tone you're using, whichever voice you're using, contributes this. So you know what the gap was, you know what your work's done, you know how you contributed to this conversation in the literature review. That's where it goes. After the literature review, theoretical perspectives, this really deep thinking chapter, we come up with the methodology, methods, data, analysis, ethical chapter. And what that does is it also uses theory, because there's theory behind the ways in which you're going to be asking your questions. And that theory enables you to develop your methodology, and it enables you to think of what methods you're actually going to use, and after that, what tools or vehicles. So if you're asking a question about people constructing an understanding of something, you would probably be using methods that enabled you to ask them direct questions, either by an interview or giving them a questionnaire. And then ultimately, you're also going to have to find ways to analyze this data, and come up with themes. So you explain also in this methodology methods chapter how you're going about the work, the tools you're using to do the work, and how you're going to analyze it. And you explain if you have ethical issues. So again, if you're working with literature, you probably don't have any. If you're working with people or animals, you have to explain you've got ethical approval. This is how you're doing the work. No harm will come to people. This is all, this is your work and your contribution to knowledge. So you're saying something about your ethical principles and your ethical processes. After we've got through all that, we start to think about actually how are we going to analyze the data, and that goes in that chapter 2. Following this, we're assuming in time that you've actually found your data. So in the actual thesis, you will then start to present your data to the reader. At this point, it's tempting to give the reader everything you've found because it's all interesting, but they're not going to read through all of that, and your job will be to make sense of it and to make an argument out of it, and initially to theorize it. So you remember that you had some theoretical perspectives way back in the literature review theoretical perspectives chapter, and you bring them to bear on analyzing your data And you also remember that you had a research question or questions, and you bring them to bear on looking at your data. And so you are focused and selective, and you're selective with what you're looking at and how you're looking at it, and the kind of understandings, the discussion, the findings that you're drawing from it. So we will have introductory bits to the data, examples of the data, theorized comments on discussing the data, and then finally you probably pulled together some top-level findings, 5 or 6 things that you found that are really important, that fit with the questions you asked and the theory. At this point, though, in the actual journey, sometimes you find something you didn't expect, and that's much more exciting than what you were hoping to expect. And you stop, and you have to find a theory to understand it. And if you find a theory to understand it, that goes back up. You explain that in the Literature Review Theoretical Perspectives chapter. And sometimes you find loads of fascinating things that you'll follow up later, because you will find a lot more than you set out to find. And you have to remember to focus in relation to the questions, in relation to the theories you're using, and just give the reader something. The first reader is your supervisor, and the next reader is your examiner. Give these readers, something to follow, a line of argument from the questions you asked, through the way you asked them, through your understanding of what the data suggests, to you being able to make some statements after you've analysed and discussed your data, some statements about what your conclusions are, what your findings and what your conclusions are. So you are developing a story of the decisions that you made about theory, about literature, about methods and methodology, and about data analysis, and about what matters in it. That's justification, explanation of the decisions you've made. That's a story. That runs all the way through your thesis. And you're also developing an argument. You set out to find something. There was a gap in the knowledge. You did it this way. What are you finding? Why does it matter? How can you make a case for it? How can you back up your case that you understand this differently, that you know something differently, backing up that case with a theorized analysis of your data. So all the way through this building that you're building as a thesis, you have a line of story about the decisions you made and the processes you went through, and you have the big line of argument. The red thread starts with your aims and questions and then takes you through all the processes of undertaking your research to what does the data really tell you, the theorized data really tell you. So in the conclusions then, you're saying, what happened on this journey? What did you do, in brief? And what is it you've found that matters? And you will have factual conclusions. We've probably got an increase in knowledge because of your work. What exactly is that? And conceptual conclusions. How do we understand things differently in a more theorized and really deep fashion? And by the time you've got that at the end of the conclusions, you've got your first go at your thesis, and that's probably going to be something you will then refine and refine until it's wonderfully coherent and beautifully presented, and then you hand it in. Of course, it doesn't stop there. You've got references, you've got charts, you've got all sorts of maybe appendices, and you've got to put various preceding data about thanking people and so forth before you hand the thesis in. But that's the rough logical shape of a whole thesis. So as you go through putting it together, remember the overall logic, remember the overall journey of the research goes into the building of the thesis. And between each of your chapters or sections, you would say the last chapter or the last section dealt with this. This is going to take it on and do that. So you have a kind of a, if you think of it as a building, you've got some cement between the different bricks of the building that says where the work's just been and where it's going next. So they really can follow how your argument in your thesis fits together. And then you come out with a perfect whole. And at that point, it seems like quite a short document because it's coherent. And we'll talk about getting coherent writing a little later.